everybody. Welcome to the Construction Record Podcast. I'm here with
Alex Carrick, Chief Economist of ConstructConnect, covering both the U.S. and Canadian construction marketplaces with statistics and forecasts.
And Michael Guckes, Senior Economist of ConstructConnect.
And we're doing our semi-regular economist check-in, and this time we're going to talk about infrastructure, specifically because the infrastructure bill, even though it's not called that anymore in the U.S., was finally passed. So we'll lean on both your expertise for that, but also other matters, infrastructure. But I guess we'd start with Michael and the U.S. infrastructure bill, such as it is. It's less than it was, but it's still more than they thought they were going to get. So maybe you could explain that a lot better than I just did.
Right. So the bill itself has a lot of great things behind it for infrastructure, and especially on the demand side for civil, of course. I did some quick back of the envelope looking into that bill. On a cursory review, it looks like there's almost $108 billion that will go into U.S. infrastructure with that bill, which if you look back at the Obama bill from right after or right during the Great Recession, that bill is slightly smaller, believe it or not. Now, granted, when we think about inflation, and you were to put both of these amounts into real terms, the Biden stimulus is smaller, but still it's very considerable. It's a very considerable amount, and so that's a good thing. The question becomes, I think, one of how quickly do these dollars convert into physical work? And I recall back when I worked for the state of Ohio during the Obama Tigers program, where it was, how quickly can we dole out the money and get these projects going? Those shovel-ready projects, could only go so far, and then there was it took time to get additional projects up and running and online and all, fully planned out and documented and get the permits. And so it actually ended up taking, several years for all of those stimulus dollars back under Obama to be spent. I suspect the same thing will happen this time. But it's all good for civil construction and of course, all of the tangential industries, right? The architects that are needed and the other developers and planners and everything that goes into pre-construction.
And Alex, I'd like to get your general impressions. And also, apparently Canada was listed as domestic producer, which is kind of a fudge, but at the same time, it's one of the big things that we were worried about getting kind of frozen out of the whole thing. So if you could talk to both those things, your general impressions and that specific point.
Well, I think there's some really interesting things have suddenly started to happen in the United States because there's really an indication that things are being thought of strategically. Like it's been a real lesson. What's happened in Europe has been a real lesson because they allowed themselves to become dependent on Russian gas. And so they weren't thinking strategically, and look at the situation they're in now. But the United States is starting to think strategically. And that's part of the impetus for the CHIPS bill, which brings computer chip manufacturing back from Asia to the United States. And those are huge projects, and there's already been a number of those projects that have happened. And then if you look at the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and then the new Inflation Reduction Act, a lot of money and a lot of incentives and a lot of the thought behind it is about climate change. And this is the first time that the United States has really indicated that it's getting on board with the rest of the world in terms of dealing with climate change. And I would go so far as to say that the last 2 decades have been all about software, have been all about technology, high tech. It's been about high tech solutions and high tech implementation. And I think the next 10 years, I think we've hit a real watershed moment here, where the next 10 years, the next maybe even longer, are going to be about a real practical shift away from fossil fuels. It's not just theoretical, it's not just hypothetical anymore. It's actually happening, and it's being backed by legislation that promotes green power sources. And of course, a big part of carbon reduction efforts are going to be the shift towards more usage of electricity and so on. Mm-hmm. And this has tremendous implications for things like commodity demand. And it means a heightened demand for copper and nickel, aluminum, lithium, and all of this is important for Canada, but it's also tremendously important for the United States. So, and certainly the car companies are all in on this, because the car companies are spending billions of dollars on new production lines for electric vehicles and new battery plants. And there's new kinds of mega projects, and so we can get into that further on if you want. But I think we've hit a watershed moment where the next certain number of years are going to be about lifestyle changes for all of us that is away from fossil fuels and towards renewables and electricity and so on. And that means big projects, it means big shifts in certain parts of the marketplace.
And just to stick with that, Michael, I know California just said they're going to allow gas cars after 2035. Right. That implies that you're going to need more electricity from more people, and not California, but that general region has had its problems with electricity supply. So will this infrastructure bill and other pushes for infrastructure help with that? Because you're going to need to have more infrastructure to have this thing happen.
Yeah, I'll tell you what, Warren, in general, I would agree with so much of what Alec just said. I think the challenge that we aren't talking about this challenge a lot, but it's the labor that's going to be needed for all of this. I absolutely agree that, if we want all of these things to happen, if the U.S. is going to get serious, about making these sort of transformative efforts, right, and how we consume energy, how we think about pollution, how we think about being good stewards of the earth, right? We need to think about where does all of this labor come from to mine the lithium, the copper, the cobalt, et cetera, right? These resources, you might be able to find them in the U.S. You might be able to find them in Europe. You might be able to find them in some other parts of the world that are willing to work with us, that have regimes that abide by a rule of law, things of that nature, human rights. We can go on and on. But the challenge just becomes one of resources, right? Will we have enough workers to do all of that mining? Will we have them in the right places, right? We need to create all the mining and construction equipment that goes along with building these huge mines, right? The pollution that goes along with this, right? So the in general, I fully agree with what Alec said. I think that what's gonna slow us down, or what could stop us, if anything, will be death by 1,000 small cuts in all of this, which is exactly what has happened in past efforts, right? We have this grand scheme. We want to go from point A to point B as a country or as a continent, and then something comes along that creates hiccup after hiccup. So those are the challenges, right? And the labor challenge in the U.S., I think, in particular, is something that we really need to address. We need to figure out, how do we get our labor participation rate up over 62%, at 63%? I mean, this number is historically very low, and it has been trending in the wrong direction for decades. We keep going down, not going up. And the reasons for that are multifold, right? We have generational shifts. The baby boomers are really leaving the workforce at such a pace that I don't believe that they are being replaced at the same clip. And even it's not even a 1-for-1 replacement. Nobody, for example, could replace our own Alex Carrick. You can't just throw me in there because I don't have 30 years of North American construction experience. So replacing Alex with somebody who's a Gen Xer or even a millennial or whatever, right? It's just, and that happens everywhere. So there's all sorts of constraints that I think we need to be talking about, because those policies around how we're going to educate and train and get that next generation of labor force properly suited and positioned so that they can help us accomplish all these great things, like creating all these mines and all these EVs and all the other technologies, right? We still need to come up with a battery recycling technology. Right now, it's people who are by hand disassembling batteries, and it's economically impossible to make that model work. So there's still a lot of things that need to be solved around the periphery before we can just say, hey, we're going to all switch to EVs and it's going to be great. We can all switch to EVs, but it may not be great quite yet.
Right. I laugh only, Alex, because he's right. 30 years of experience that we're going to draw upon right now, because the minute you mentioned lithium and all the rest of it, I thought, oh, that's where Canada comes in. We are the mining country. We've got all this, or a lot of it anyway, but we also need the infrastructure to get to it. And we have an even bigger labor problem, I think, than you guys do in some ways. But Alex, you correct me on that.
Well, it's absolutely true that there's huge challenges in so many of these areas, because it's not easy to find labor to do some of these things. But there's been challenges in the past, and I hate to repeat myself, but I've never, in my experience, seen anything like a shortage of labor that there was when plans were made to go ahead with all those projects in the oil sands. Mm-hmm. And the industry at the time said those projects could not possibly proceed because there weren't the workers. But they did. They went ahead, and those projects, they got built. And yeah, I know that the industry talks about labor shortages. And I know it's not just the construction industry, it's all aspects of the economy, and people are going to have to be retrained, or there's other ways that you draw on labor. You draw on more, try to get more women involved in certain areas of the economy, and more Native people. And frankly, immigration has always been a huge source of labor supply for Canadian projects and U.S. projects, but that's going to take a rethinking of whether the public wants immigration. And that's why I'm a big proponent of immigration. I don't believe in cutting off immigration. In terms of Canada and growth rates between Canada and the United States, I like all these exciting things that are happening, because I think the U.S. is getting a whole lot smarter about where they want to go, where they want the economy to go. The advantage that Canada has in terms of GDP growth is population growth. There's two advantages right now. One of them is population growth, because Canada is still having a lot of immigrant arrivals, and Canadian population is growing faster, a lot faster than the population in the United States. And the other is that there's been a big shift in terms of foreign trade. And foreign trade contributes directly to the bottom line of gross domestic product. And for 10 years, Canada was having a deficit in foreign trade. But now, because prices have improved for things like oil and natural gas and potash and a whole bunch of other commodities, Canada last month had a foreign trade surplus of $60 billion annualized. And that's the first time that's happened in 10 years. That's the highest number. And those kind of figures will contribute to GDP. And so I know labor is a problem. There's going to have to be programs to deal with it. There's going to have to be incentives. But that's the challenge. There's always challenges in the economy. There's always times where you wonder if you can really go ahead. And somehow we do muddle through.
Correct me if I'm wrong. I just did a super quick search on Canadian birth rates for 2021, for 2019. I think it's per the World Bank. We're looking at 1.47, 1.49, somewhere in there. I'm looking at a couple of different numbers. I believe the number that you need to target just to keep things level is 1.66. Is that right? And the US is not much better. I think this data here is showing about 1.7. So regardless, I think both countries need to reconsider, how do you incentivize, the birth rate, right?
Well, yeah, but the thing in Canada is it's immigration. I mean,
Mhm.
80% of the population increase in Canada, 80% is immigration.
Sure.
The birth rate, no, the birth, but that's the same around the world. The only place where the birth rate is high is in the Middle East. If you look at the countries, Saudi Arabia and those countries in the Middle East, they still have high birth rates. But almost everywhere else, with affluence, goes a drop in birth rates. So it's immigration,
Mhm.
and that's why I really am an advocate of strong population growth and immigration. The more people there are, historically, over centuries, countries grow fastest when they have strong population growth and good immigration.
That's a great point. One of the things that I've been talking about recently in my presentations around the U.S. has been the point that while unemployment in the United States, for example, in recent quarters has been really low, and a lot of people point to that and say, look, we're not in a recession. Look at how low unemployment is. We have essentially full employment because of that. And I say to them at the same time, well, think about what are the bounds, what are the constraints to the growth of an economy? Well, there's really two, right? There's labor and there's resources, material resources, right? And to some degree, there's some other ones, capital, technology. So there are a handful of factors that are huge determinants of just how fast and how big an economy can be. And when you think about what we're seeing in the data, for all the reasons I was talking about just a few moments ago, right? I see labor as almost a constraint anymore on the ability of the United States to grow. The simple fact that we have we've maxed out our ability to employ people, labor, for economic purposes tells me that, well, that has now become a constraint. And we've never really had to think about that in the past, right? In prior decades and in prior generations, right, there was always enough labor for whatever reason. It was never a constraint like it is today. And I'm wondering if more people don't need to be seeing the current employment situation, the current labor situation, really more as a bad thing. We're hitting up against a bound rather than saying it's a good thing because look how low unemployment itself is.
I'm just curious about one thing. This whole discussion made me think of this. I was recently talking to a friend. He was telling me about how Shenzhen, the ports are all completely automated. I don't know how much that hype is, how much is true. But then you got things like Amazon, where there's a bunch of robots working in concert with people, and this is just going to happen more and more. Is that a good or bad thing? Is that going to address this labor problem, or is it a lot of pie in the sky talk at this point? To either of you guys.
Well, no, that's the whole thing. This is what I'm saying, that companies adjust. If you've got a labor problem, companies adjust. They set up their own training programs. They bring in people from outside, and certainly modular, tilt-up construction, robotics, all these things. They're going to find a way to go ahead with these projects because their livelihoods depend on them. So they're going to find a way, and that's going to be yeah, that's going to be a plus. And I certainly would subscribe and hope that does come. And modular has been a little slow taking off in North America. It's been much bigger force in the construction industry in other countries. But yeah, look at the retailers, the Amazons and so on, and the ports, as you say, that they're using robotics everywhere. So yes, I
Right.
definitely a trend. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Automation, I mean, when we think about automation in vehicles, right, we think of a Tesla or somebody like that. But, I'm maybe a little weird. I know that Caterpillar does amazing things with automation of their mining vehicles, right? And that's a great example where, if we need a lot more mining capacity worldwide in order to achieve some of these forward-looking initiatives that we started off this whole discussion about, right? Well, Caterpillar and firms like that are going to need to continue to rely on that. And that's something I think that Alec and I both are talking about in general, is this theme of, well, where there are challenges are just opportunities. You just haven't figured out how to monetize them yet, right? So is labor a problem? Yeah, sure, there isn't enough of it. One could argue. But does that mean that we simply can't grow? No, it just means that the way that we grow is going to look very particular. And those companies that are sort of young enough in spirit and innovative enough to recognize these things and act on these constraints, they will be the ones that figure out how do we get around the constraints, and they will hopefully do very well because of that. And that's the beauty of a free market system.
Yeah. That's the thing. This is why the American system, the capitalist system, and the free market system really does pay off. Now there, I saw somewhere where somebody came up with a quote, and I really like it. And it was, and it pertains to the car industry, because if you start to really go into electric vehicles and so on, what you've really got is you've got a computer on wheels. Mm-hmm. And that changes how cars are made and how cars are thought of and so on. So there's already a lot of robotics that's being used in car assemblies. But no wonder a company like Amazon and Apple in particular, want to get into the car business, because cars are great big mobile computers. So you got to. So it's about thinking about things differently. It's you got to flip around your approach to a lot of these things and think about things differently. The kinds of new industries that are happening is space travel. Like suddenly there's space tourism and thoughts of flying off to Mars and so on, which weren't there before. Boeing is going to be flying to the International Space Station, and that's the private sector that's getting into that. And then there's industries like trying to derive plastics from plants, and that's something new. And polymers and drones and cyber security companies and so on. So there's all kinds of exciting things that are going on, and the kinds of people who are going to work for these companies are going to have different training than they've had in the past. There's going to have to be like EV engineers and so on. So yeah, lots of challenges. Bio and nanotechnology. Man, what kind of degree do you have to really be successful in that industry?
Well, it's above my pay grade, I can tell you that. So we started with roads and we're ending with nanotechnology. I can't think of a better place to stop this immediately before we go into the realms of fiction, if we haven't already. So thank you again, Michael and Alex, for joining us.
Sure thing. Yeah, it's
Our
fun.
pleasure.
Fun. Yeah, my pleasure. Yeah.